Hi again, Mark here from Talking Bass. This week I'm going to touch on a topic that many bass players are having to address at the moment. During much of 2020, the whole world has been subjected to a variety of different lockdown situations due to the COVID-19 pandemic, and during that time we've all found ourselves with a little more practice time on our hands. So in a time with so many negative impingements on living in general, some of us can take heart from the little positives like improving our bass playing. But this new availability of time has left many bass players pondering the question, what do I practice? So today I'm going to point out a few tips on the basics of practice and how you can make the most of your time. Now, one of the things that I hear from bass players all the time is I'm stuck in a rut and I don't know what to practice. Or I'm bored of playing the same old exercises and songs. And I always find this a frustrating thing to hear. There's no reason that you should be running out of things to practice. Music provides a whole universe of content and topics to study, and if you can't think of any areas to work on, then you're probably looking at it through a very limited lens. So one of the first things that you need to do in planning out your practice is to do a little bit of honest introspection and work out what areas of playing need work. Now, I don't just mean little vague things like I can't play fast enough or I can't slap like Victor. I'm talking about the wider areas of study. For instance, can you read music? How well can you read music? How good is your ear? How are your transcription skills? How's your knowledge of functional harmony? What's your walking bass like? All of these areas of music and more can provide a lifetime of study and practice, and all of them will provide benefits on your musicianship beyond the basic study itself. And trust me, once you start down just one of these paths, you'll never want for practice material again. They are literally endless. So to help with developing your practice and assessing your ability, I've come up with a simple acronym that will give you at least some direction in terms of seeking out the resources that you need and developing a practice routine. The acronym is RAISE, so think raise your bass game. The letters of RAISE stand for the following. R is reading, A is applied harmony, I is improvisation, S is style and repertoire, and E is ear training. Now, for many of you, these topics might all sound like stuff you haven't practiced before, especially if you just potter around playing a few scale patterns that you've learned from YouTube, or maybe playing along to your favorite songs. So let's have a look at each in turn and how you might get started with them. First, we have reading. Now, bass players and guitarists are notoriously bad at reading music. Guitarists tend to be worse than bass players in my experience, but nevertheless, bass players tend to be pretty bad. A lot of this is down to the proliferation of tablature, but I also think it's partly due to there being so little in the way of educational bass reading resources. But trust me, if you start down the reading path, you will never ever want for practice material again. There's a little buffer phase at the start where you need to really let go of your ego and, embrace that beginner vibe. But once you're up and running, you'll see massive improvements in every area of your playing. If there was ever a good time to start on your reading, then now's the time. Now, let's first address why reading is such an important skill to learn. Well, first, it helps with the actual reading of music. Obviously. And that should be reason enough for most people, but there are also side benefits that aren't immediately obvious to non-readers. First, reading will completely sort out your knowledge of the fretboard. You'll very quickly learn every note on the neck. Reading involves transferring a note from the page to the fretboard, and that constant cycle of seeing a note and then playing that note in all positions is going to build that mapping of the neck really quickly. Reading also changes the way that you approach rhythm. When we learn to read rhythms, we do so in a very systemized way, and because of this, you'll find your rhythmic knowledge, recognition, accuracy, and vocabulary develops to a much higher level. Reading also helps with many areas of music theory. Music theory and harmony can be quite tough to understand if you don't recognize the notes that are being displayed. So that's one thing, but also when you're learning to read, you'll have to cover many areas of theory, such as key signatures, the circle of fifths, relative major and minor keys, and much more. So learning to read will give you a practical understanding of how and why this theory is used. So how do you go about learning to read? Well, it can be tough to find an overall method, but luckily you're in the right place. Talking Bass has a complete reading method called Simple Steps to Sight Reading that covers reading from the absolute basics through to professional level sight reading. It's a step-by-step progressive method containing hundreds of pages of lesson material, many hours of video content, and an exhaustive set of backing tracks. As an example, here's a short riff excerpt from later in the course. This is an example of 16th notes and rests in the key of C minor, and if I was to read along to that riff, it'd sound like this. Now, many of you will look at that clip of music and have no idea where to start with it. Even if the notes aren't too hard for you, the rhythms might throw you off a little, especially on a first read. But then take a look at this note reading exercise from early in the first level. This is a very simple set of notes played on the A string in the low position, and the first 8 bars would sound like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. So these examples outline the progression of the course. We start with the absolute basics and work up in incredibly small and simple steps until we reach notes over the entire fretboard, rhythms right through to tied 16th notes, every major and minor key, a variety of time signatures including cut common, compound time and odd time signatures, and also every symbol that you're ever likely to see on the page. So if you want to get started on reading, I've put a link in the info below. So by learning to read, you're going to suddenly improve your practice time immensely, and it's the one area of playing that I would say you can rely on in terms of seeing transformative benefits at every stage. But what else do we have in the RAISE acronym? Well, next is applied harmony. Now, I use this term to relate to pretty much all aspects of harmony and how they can be applied to the bass. This is the study of chord tones, scales, chord progressions, and all the theory surrounding all of that stuff. So when you learn about chord tones or scales, it's not enough to just learn an arpeggio or learn a major scale in a 1-octave box shape. That doesn't really help with anything. You need to learn about how all of these nuts and bolts work in music. Now, at the heart of this is the study of chord construction and how chords work within a key. We can do this through the use of chord tones, which you'll probably know a little better by their more common name of arpeggios. You need to understand the principles of how we build chords and then how they're created within a key from a scale. So for instance, if you're confronted by the chord of G major 7 on a chord chart, do you know what those notes are? Do you know that it's G, B, D and F sharp? Can you play those notes on the bass? Do you know that arpeggio in 2 octaves? And do you know it in many positions around the bass? Once you understand these basic fundamentals, you can start to understand chord progressions, and you'll find that a lot of music theory that you might have shied away from suddenly becomes much easier to digest, and you'll also find learning and writing songs a lot easier. Again, if you want help with learning about chord tones or any of these concepts, I've got free lessons on YouTube covering a few of the basic principles, but you'll also find the chord tone essentials and scale essentials courses over at TalkingBass. I've also got assorted theory lessons on the lesson map at TalkingBass covering everything from basic intervals through to the application of chord tones and scales in your bass playing. Next we have improvisation. Now this is one of those areas that you'll find many advanced players devoting most of their attention. You only have to look at some of the practice vlogs from guys like Yannick Gwizdala to see how much solo improvisation is a part of his routine. However, for most of you beginner and intermediate players, advanced jazz soloing might be a step too far at this point. But one thing I would advise is the practice of improvising bass lines. Now this can be something as simple as working around basic root notes to a backing track, or even just playing through a chord progression on your own, just outlining the various chord tones. Improvisation is simply the spontaneous creation of music. So if you're being creative and making up riffs on the fly, that's improvisation. But if you want to really explore improvisation in a very structured way, then I'd advise looking at walking bass. To effectively improvise walking bass lines, you need to understand many of the concepts that I talked about earlier in terms of applied harmony. Walking bass is the perfect application of these principles as you develop your ability to weave a melodic line through a chord progression. And once you can walk through a set of chords, those melodic concepts will cross over to other styles. So a walking bass line through a simple 1-6-2-5 progression in C might sound like this. But if we change up the rhythm and style, that can cross over to sound like this. This is the reason that a master of melodic bass like James Jamerson was able to create such awesome bass lines. He came from an upright jazz background and knew how to walk. Next up we have style and repertoire. Now I mention styles because any of you wanting to become a professional bass player will need to understand the idiosyncratic requirements of the various styles that you might encounter. Playing in a variety of styles will diversify your playing and technique and take you out of any little stylistic bubbles that you might inhabit. For example, if you spent all your time playing death metal tunes, disco bass playing is going to seem like an alien style, but by practicing in a style unfamiliar, you'll broaden your vocabulary and improve your overall technical diversity. Styles also include various technical requirements like slap bass for funk or deeper levels of bass line creation like walking bass in jazz. So I'd consider walking bass a great thing to practice for many different reasons. You learn to read chord charts, you apply every concept of harmony in developing a melodic line, you build vocabulary and learn to improvise, and you also learn to play in the jazz style. Trust me, if you get called for a gig and there's going to be even a small number of jazz standards to play, if you can't walk, then you're going to have big problems. Now, I named this element style and repertoire, and that's because one of the best ways to learn a variety of styles and just learn to play in general is by building a repertoire. You just need to learn songs. Lots and lots and lots of songs. Building a repertoire develops a foundation of tunes to which you can relate all of the other areas of study. When you're learning all about chord tones and scales, you'll be able to relate it all back to those riffs and bass lines that you've learned, so it all makes a lot more sense. You'll also become a much more employable bass player because you'll be able to sit in on bands at short notice. One of the biggest feathers that you can have in your cap as a bass player is a large repertoire. Yes, you know, it's impressive to be able to solo through giant steps, you know, at 300 beats per minute, but it's way more impressive to the majority of musicians if you have a huge repertoire and know any tune called at the drop of a hat. So you want to practice songs every time you practice, work on all the most popular tunes in every style, build playlists of the most popular pop tunes in every era, every big name from Elvis to Queen to the Stones and, beyond. Every style from disco to metal and country. Take the top 20 tunes in every category and learn them. You'll develop your playing technique in a natural way and start to see patterns in every song that you learn. The more songs you learn, the easier it is to learn others, and before you know it, you'll be a song learning machine. Finally, we have E, which is ear training, and this is the development of your musical ear and your ability to both recognize notes as you hear them and to play what you hear in your head. There are more traditional methods of ear training, such as solfege, which is a great way to learn, but for the majority of bass players out there, I can recommend 2 tips that you can get started with right now. First of all, transcribe music. Listen to tunes and learn the bass lines. Learn the vocal melodies, learn the guitar melodies, whatever you can. As you learn to read music, you'll also develop the ability to write those transcriptions down. So you'll be connecting all of these separate areas of musicianship. Transcription is a great way of developing your ear and should be a part of your practice right from the start. Second, you want to start singing the notes along as you play them. You don't have to be a great singer, I'm terrible. Just hum along in whatever way you want. So if you're playing something like a scale, you might hum along like this, ba 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 ba, or an arpeggio, ba 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 ba, or even riffs, ba 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 ba. By singing along to the notes in this way, you help to bridge that gap between the notes that you play on the bass and your inner musical voice. You're not just a spectator anymore as, your fingers dance around, throwing notes at you. You become an active participant, and as you do this more and more, you'll build the ability to speak through the instrument. So that's the 5 elements of raise, and after all of that, we can actually break it down to a few key elements that are worth practicing from this day forward. Practice reading, study harmony, learn to play walking bass lines, learn as many songs as you can, and start transcribing music. By bearing those few elements in mind, you'll always have something to work on. Like I mentioned earlier, if you feel like you don't have anything to practice, you're just not looking at it from the correct perspective. Also, I would say it's worth focusing on a specific topic when getting started. So if you're looking to get your reading on track, just focus on reading for a few weeks. Eventually, you'll get over that initial hump and then find it much easier to work on other things alongside your reading. Many people like to try and develop, practice logs and strict routines, which are fine if they work for you, but I've always found them too hard to stick to consistently. For me, focusing delivers the most efficient and impactful approach when learning anything. Now, before I go, you might be thinking, where does technique fall in all of this? Because there are probably quite a few of you out there that want to work on your technique. Well, technique falls under what I call the 3 T's: time, tone, and technique. These aren't really specific topics of study like those I mentioned earlier, like, harmony. These are aspects of playing that should be considered every step of the way. So as you practice all of those wider ranging topics, you want to be bearing them in mind. Your timing, your tone, and your technique are very personal aspects of your playing that contribute to your overall voice on the instrument. You can focus on them individually at times, but you'll find they develop naturally as you work on all of the other topics provided, especially, if you're bearing them in mind. When you build your repertoire and learn songs, your time and your technique are naturally going to improve, and you'll find yourself experimenting with tone as you strive to fit in with the style required. So I haven't ventured into those 3 T's much here because I don't really think they'll provide long-lasting practice resources to the same extent as the ones that I've mentioned. But I do cover all of those areas in many of the lessons here on YouTube and at Talking Bass. So you can look out for those and always bear them in mind as you work on the more in-depth areas of study. Okay, so that's some tips to help with practice during these lockdown times. As always, please like, comment, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. Remember, all the courses mentioned here are available over at Talking Bass, so hit the link in the info below, and I'll see you next week.